a dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We've had some requests to do book reviews and that kind of thing, things that maybe we've been looking at recently.
Yep.
So today, instead of the regular 3 sections of Pioneers, News and Cultures, we're going to be reviewing 2 books and another thing. So we'll move on to the first one. So, to start with, I'd like to review a book that I've been reading recently. It's called A History of Applied Linguistics from 1980 to the Present by Kees de Bot. Have you heard of Kees de Bot?
I'm not sure. Maybe not.
Name's familiar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be important. We'll come back to that later on. So, from the title, A History of Applied Linguistics from 1980 to the Present, what would you expect?
1980.
1980.
1980. I don't know if you call that history, necessarily. But anyway.
Well, it's still 30 odd years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe some talking about some of the methodologies or the changing paradigms, maybe some of the individuals involved.
Okay. Yeah. How would you expect it to be presented? Like narratively?
Chronologically.
Okay.
That would make sense, wouldn't it? Maybe not.
Yeah, I guess so. Either chronologically or within each, maybe different chapters focusing on different things, and then chronologically within those chapters.
Okay. Well, the first thing that Kees de Bot does is he defines what he means by applied linguistics. Okay.
Sure.
So this is his definition of applied linguistics. See if you think this is a good definition. The development and use of multiple languages. That's his definition.
The development and use of multiple languages. Okay.
Yeah. Do you think that's a good definition? No, I don't think so. 'Cause, I mean, when I did my master's degree in applied linguistics, it was all about like discourse analysis and all loads of stuff. I think
the key word is applied, isn't it? How studies in language are applied to other things.
Yeah.
Right. I guess he's just applying it to development of a second language, presumably.
Yeah, and that's what he says. He says within applied linguistics there are lots of different schools of thought about what constitutes applied linguistics.
Yeah.
For him, applied linguistics is basically synonymous with SLA.
Right.
So the history of applied linguistics is actually really a history of SLA research.
Okay.
Which is
So then 1980 makes a bit more sense.
Yeah.
Someone's written that book there, haven't they already?
Really? Who?
I don't know the name exactly, but it sounds familiar.
Okay, all right. So the title, A History of Applied Linguistics, maybe we can question the idea that it's about applied linguistics generally. It's quite specific. How about the next bit of history? So you were saying maybe it would be presented in a chronological order, something like that. Now what he's actually done is he's interviewed, either through email or face-to-face, lots and lots of scholars and asked them for their opinions about certain things. And then he's collated a lot of the data into tables and things like that. So, for example, let's see, who are the leaders of the field? He asked people to vote on who they thought were the most significant leaders in the field, and then he's worked out who got the most votes and then put them in a chapter with a bit of information about each one and some key publications.
So he's made himself a...
Yes, well, I'll come to that in a second.
Okay.
He also did the most important books and articles in applied linguistics from 1980 to the present. Again, just vote and, that kind of thing. What are the main trends in applied linguistics? Trends 2, which is the sequel chapter. Trends 3, which is the threequel chapter. And then he goes on about citations for a long time. So it's not really a history either. It's more, and he actually says this in the introduction. He says it's more of a state of the art.
Yeah, that's what it seems.
Yeah. And in fact, he says this is in the introduction. He says one of the reviewers of this book wrote, "One drawback of this approach is that the data is reported but not analysed, and the reader is required to do almost all the thinking. Isn't there the slight danger that, at best, this reads a little like extracts from things my friends said about applied linguistics in their letters to me, and at worst, simply like an unfinished draft?"
That's in the introduction.
That's in the introduction, and he says, "This may be true, and the risk is there, but this is a choice I've made consciously." And I have to say, it does. I mean, I think that reviewer was right. It's not a history, and it's not about applied linguistics. And Keisterbot himself he's an SLA kind of guy. He's done work on bilingualism and things like that, and kind of social cultural theory in SLA. And it reads to me like someone who is trained in statistics and science trying to write a history, which is not that kind of area. So he's approached it in that kind of way by gathering lots of data and then collating it into tables, and counting things. So it's kind of interesting as an approach, but yeah, I mean, how does that sound to you guys?
Misleading.
Yeah, I mean, you never know. His editor at the last minute might have said, "Let's call it a history of applied linguistics."
It sells books, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, he does seem to. I think it was his idea, to be honest, to write a history of applied linguistics.
But I mean, you can use statistics or data like that to present a history. Like, does it not show any development in the numbers of publications, for example, the number of, I don't know.
What do you mean, the number of
Does
publications?
it not present, like, does it not show on
Right,
graphs
so some kind of development
the
or
development,
change
yeah.
from 1980.
Yeah, I mean, it talks about the trend, so that's the section that's most about development. So that he has 3 sections about trends. So the theoretical aspects, like linguistic theory. He's got Jeff Jordan referenced here, which is quite good. And then he goes through things like dynamic systems theory and complex dynamic and all that kind of stuff. So he talks about how certain things have developed over time, but it's very piecemeal. It's not. Yeah. And again, it's not built on an analysis of all the material that's been produced. It's in the opinions of his informants.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what that reviewer said about it's up to the reader to kind of do all the work. Is that how you felt when you were reading it?
Not completely, I don't think, because like when he says for example, the most influential publications. He does present the ones that his informants say are the most influential publications. Now, my problem is that he, as an SLA guy, is speaking mostly to other people in his field of interest. So what you get is, things that are very influential among Keisterbot's group of SLA friends,
right,
and not amongst applied linguistics as a whole. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I enjoyed reading the book. I learned some stuff from it. I think as a state of the art, it's interesting, but I think it fails in its mission of being a history of applied linguistics.
Why 1980?
Because he sees that as kind of the year zero of when theory really started to take off. So he does mention some of the other histories that have been done, like Howard and Kelly and Titone and all those kinds of things. But he for him, it's more about the history of scholarship. But again, it's more of a state of the art than anything else. Okay. And also, this was you mentioned before in this section of the leaders. So this is people that his informants voted as being the leaders in the field. So we've got Claire Cramch, Meryl Swain, James Lantoff, Diane Larson Freeman, Michael Long, Henry Widowson.
Sure. Few previous interviewers there.
Yes,
interviewees there.
Yep. And Keisterbot as well.
The author of the book.
The author of the book, yeah.
How does he write about himself?
He did. He says Keisterbot worked on a number of topics, including bilingual language production, language attrition, language and aging, and the application of dynamic systems theory to language development and multilingualism. And then there's a quote: "He introduced an L2 version of Levelt's speaking model, something the field was waiting for." So again, I think I understand why he's done this, because what he's done is he's collated his data, and the fact that he appears in the data, whatever. But the fact that it's a lot of his friends and colleagues that are voting for it, that's why I think he's shown up in the data. And if it was me writing this book, I think just out of modesty, I would have removed myself from the list, or just made mention I was in this list, but I'm not going to put myself in because I don't see the point.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, what have I swayed you? Do you want to buy it?
That copy of you. You're trying to.
But you said you enjoyed reading. Is it well written?
It is.
Okay.
Yes, it's very readable.
Okay.
I read it in just about 2 days. It's it's an interesting book. It's enjoyable.
What did you get from it that you didn't know before?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think I could point to something specific. It gave me more of a feel of the field than I had at the start. It opened me up to some new scholars that I didn't know about before. But I wouldn't say that I got a huge amount out of it. I mean, a lot of it is what you'd kind of expect to be like. What are the most influential papers and books? Well, there are some that I hadn't heard of, but for the most part, it's what you'd expect to be the most influential papers and books. So I didn't learn a huge amount. I think it's mistitled. Yeah. I think it would be interesting to see an actual history of this with accounts of conferences and so on. But yeah, I don't think this is the book to do that. But yeah, as I was asking before, what do you think? Are you tempted to read it?
I guess. Yeah. I guess. I don't know. It's not high on my list. Like you presented as a lot of data, a lot of charts and tables, which doesn't sound that. I don't know. It's
not all charts and tables.
Yeah,
I mean, there's charts and tables kind of supporting it. There's also a lot of description and quite interesting stuff.
Okay.
So I might have been a little bit
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. State of the art of SLA sounds interesting.
Yeah. It's not completely SLA. Like, he does bring up things like English as a lingua franca. So there's a bit about linguistic description in there as well.
Okay.
But yeah, I think the use of the term applied linguistics when that's not what he means.
And especially a history of.
Yeah, a history of applied linguistics.
Quite comprehensive.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's our first review.
Okay, so this follows on quite nicely from Rob's review of A History of Applied Linguistics, or A State of the Art of SLA, as we think it should be called. This was a webinar that I attended. That's not the right word, is it?
You attend a webinar?
Watched.
But you didn't attend it in real time, right?
No, I watched it 2 days later.
That's
not
attending.
2 days later, but I was there.
I watched the video of a conference.
Yeah. It was a webinar conducted by Richard Smith of the University of Warwick.
And friend of the show.
Friend of the show, former interviewee.
Unofficial advisor.
You can find that. The title of the talk, or the webinar, was Learning from the Past, Researching ELT History.
Nice.
And it was conducted on behalf of the IATEF or Research SIG, or ReSIG.
Okay.
ReSIG.
SIG again.
And it was brought to my attention via Twitter. Richard Smith linked me into a Twitter message.
Well, linked us?
Us, sorry, not me personally. Well, and so that's what made me go and watch it, basically. Webinars, are you familiar with webinars?
I saw this one, so I'm familiar with this one.
So it had the usual format. You have the box with the speaker in, webcam, PowerPoint display.
Screen, like window.
Little box.
Oh, right, okay.
Terminology.
Little boxes.
And a message board.
I'm kind of aware of webinars, but I've never actually watched one.
Yeah, I never understand the point of the message board. It's like people write stuff, and it's always just it's always people coming in late and going, "Hello, I'm here now."
There was a few questions, but they weren't looked at till the end.
Yeah, and some of the really interesting questions just got ignored.
There's a few quotes. I think Scott Thornbury was...
He was in there, yeah.
So these are people commenting, chatting to each other while the lecture's going on?
Yeah, or they're also sending him things
to
talk about,
whoever the
presenter is. Yeah.
But what's he doing? He's giving a presentation?
Yeah.
But he's supposed to also read these comments and respond to them?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he has to be multi-talented.
I guess so.
Yeah, so that was how it was the usual format. Very like Rob mentions that the title of that book might be misleading, and Richard kind of said the same thing about his talk. He said you probably won't learn any lessons today. So
the learning from the past part.
Yeah, he said there aren't really any lessons. He said it's hard to say what history teaches us, as it's not there to give us lessons. But what it does offer is a perspective on the present day.
Yeah.
So
Which is a kind of lesson.
Which is a kind of, that's what you said. This is the lesson. It's perspective.
Yeah.
So I'll give a little review of the talk. I don't want to give too much away of it because I think it's still available. You can go and watch it. We'll perhaps put a link to it with this episode.
Right.
I think it should be available by anyway.
Okay.
So Richard Smith talks of the lessons he learned in particular, and he talks about continuity being one of the key points.
Right.
And he uses the first part of his talk to chart continuity and gives an example about how the present-day ELT journal, the Oxford ELT journal, how it relates back to Henry Sweet, who we
discussed that previously. The history of the ELT,
amongst other pioneers, TEFL pioneers.
Yeah.
Our TEFL pioneers, such as Daniel Jones and Harold Palmer.
Yeah.
And the idea of continuity, he talks about how the present-day ELT journal grew out of a bulletin that originated in Japan.
The IRET. Was it IRET?
It was originally written by Harold Palmer, and then Hornby took over it. And then
Ash Hornby.
He went back to the UK during the war and continued it, basically. So that was how...
Our listeners know all this. They've heard us talk about it.
Yeah. We're doing a history of the TEFLology history.
So that was kind of something that was... I imagine if you were hearing that for the first time, would be quite interesting. I didn't know that.
Were you not paying attention when we talked about it?
I mean, I didn't know it before we talked about it.
Okay.
But, and there's also some other interesting facts that I don't want to spoil. About the ELT journal, they're there, like to find them. And Richard also talks about his motivations for researching ELT.
Yeah.
And he's currently researching the history of the British Council in ELT, in particular, and also the development of IA TEFL.
Yeah. I wonder what when people say motivations, there's always when I've heard Richard talk about this kind of thing before. There's always this kind of feeling like there's a need to justify why you're interested in researching this particular kind of history. Yeah. And for me, I'm interested in reading about it. I don't research it, but I'm interested in reading about it. And for me, the justification is just the sort of the intellectual pleasure of knowing about it,
Yeah.
And I wonder why there has to be a stronger motivation than that.
He talks about the need.
Maybe if you want funding.
He talks about one area that kind of struck a chord with me that I thought, this is a good thing to research, is it often answers dominant myths, and it fills in the gaps with oversimplified explanations of methods. So, that seems to be one motivation for going into it as well. He also uses a quote from, can you remember, Rob also watched it as well, he was from Stern,
A
paucity of studies, was that?
I can't remember exactly. I've got the book in my office, but it's not here.
Just saying that there's a general lack of this kind of stuff out there, basically, and that's maybe another motivation. Yeah, perhaps. He also called for more research into practice, not just theory or methods, but approaches that are actually taking place on the ground.
Right.
And I guess what he means by this are kind of local contexts, local teaching practices and traditions.
Yakudoku.
For example, Yakudoku, that we talked about with Richard as well. Local teaching traditions in Japan, for example. Richard makes clear in the webinar that there's a lack of interest in this area. However, he showed that there are plenty of examples of studies that have been done. A surprising point was the amount of interest and work that's going on, not just in English-speaking countries, but Japan in particular and Germany as well have organisations doing their own research in German and Japanese.
Yeah. Actually, as I said, I've been reading a bit about ELT history, and there's a book by Kelly called 25 Centuries of Language Teaching, and that's kind of the most comprehensive because it covers such a long time. But then I found there's a guy called Renzo Titone, who also wrote a book called Teaching Foreign Languages, A Historical Sketch. But then I Googled him, and I found other books he'd written, and he's got one book in Spanish. He mainly wrote in Spanish, called 5 Millennia of Language Teaching. So, in Spanish, there's the most comprehensive book, and you can't read it unless you can speak Spanish.
Towards the end of the webinar, Richard offers rules for research, which I found quite practical. One rule, there was many rules, but one rule being to make evidence-based assertions Another being to use primary sources as much as possible. For example, documents, newspapers, and diaries from the time. And Richard also says how he contacted, I think, Harold Palmer's great-granddaughter. And he showed us on the camera, he had unpublished diary entries, manuscripts in his own handwriting.
Right.
So he said, as much as possible, try and get to the primary source.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we're doing our TEFL Pioneers, we can't always do that.
Or ever.
It made me feel like maybe we should try and do that, make more of an effort to do that. But
yeah, I mean, we do aim to provide an overview as opposed to reading their diaries.
And he also talks about the need to be critical, but I think that kind of goes for every kind of research in general, I guess, and triangulate these sources as well. What I also liked about the webinar is it came to us live from the ELT archive at the University of Warwick, which is, I'm not sure if it's Richard Smith's office or a separate library, but he was surrounded by all these books. And he often picked up like large volumes to kind of show the viewer. I
wasn't sure if that was. I don't think the archive was in his office. I think those were just his books, and then he had some on the desk that he was showing.
Right, because he did show a picture.
I think that's somewhere else. I'm not sure. I'm not sure
if it was the same room. But
yeah,
and Rich is very open. He wants people to visit the archive and get more involved. In it. And I think generally what this webinar has shown that there's a lot to find out and not a lot of people doing it.
Yeah. Teflology road trip.
Yeah. That'd be live from the archive.
That's the archive. Yeah.
Live in an archive.
So the original webinar went out on January. I think I'm not sure if I said, but January the 25th, and it was live at the time. I watched the recorded version, but it should still be available at the time this goes out, and we'll provide a link to it.
Yeah.
So that's that.
The book that I'm going to review in this section, the title is Teacher Evaluation in Second Language Education.
Okay.
Edited by Amanda Howard and Helen Donahue.
Okay.
Published by Bloomsbury in 2015. Very new book.
Okay, all right.
Page 1.
The audiobook version.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, it's about teacher evaluation in second language education.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yep.
It's not misnomers like.
No, it does what it says. However, it's edited by them, so it's a series of chapters.
Okay.
Each with a different author.
Right.
Yep.
Put your rattle down.
And it's divided into 4 sections. Part 1 is called Key Approaches.
Okay.
Part 2 is called Tools for Investigation and Collaboration.
Right.
Part 3 is Focus on Discourse. And Part 4 is Participant Responses.
Okay.
Any idea what those separate sections are?
No.
Yeah. I couldn't quite figure out how they divide. They explain in the introduction how they divide it up.
Yeah.
But basically, it's a good book, I guess. Who do you think the target audience is?
Teacher, like DOSes.
Right.
DOSers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe yourself. Maybe you're evaluating yourself.
Maybe.
They often use the word reflection, not evaluation.
Yeah.
So maybe that's not the case.
So there is a lot of reference to reflection, to self-reflection in the book. But as far as I can tell, they never really state explicitly, but as far as I can tell, it's basically for, DOSes, teacher trainers, SALTA trainers, those kind of people. Right. And it's mainly focusing on evaluation through observation.
Okay.
So different ways of observing teachers, different reasons to observe, etc. A lot of what comes up a lot is differences between observing pre-service and in-service teachers.
Right.
Do you have experience of both?
What, being or observing?
Observing.
Being observed as a pre-service teacher and being observed as an in-service teacher?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were some of the key differences you noticed?
I was crap at the start and then got better.
Oh, yeah?
I
mean, in terms of your approach, your attitude towards being observed.
I actually always hated being observed. So on the CELTA, I like froze up, I was very concerned about what the trainer thought. I think later on, especially with regular observations, I became a bit more confident about it, and like I could justify and I could argue back against the person and say, well, no, I've got principles behind why I'm doing this, and even if you don't agree,
Yeah, from at the pre-service stage, I was just looking to get through that class. Have I done everything that I said I was going to do?
Right.
I don't really know what I'm doing, but I need to look like I know what I'm doing. I was worried more about the form of the class rather than actually what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? How it looked rather than what I'm actually teaching or doing.
Right.
So I think that's, just in general, I think that's what's changed about teaching.
Yeah, kind of the same. Like during my CELTA, for example, I was much more worried about the lesson, and maybe not. I knew that I wasn't. It was my first time, or not quite, but it's almost my first time in front of a class. So I wasn't really expecting myself to be a good teacher, but wanting to get through it, obviously. And then maybe similar to you, as an in-service teacher, I always hated being observed. Up until relatively recently, I really hated being observed.
Yeah. Can I ask, what are their, or do they even say, what are the underlying assumptions about this book? Like when you say teacher evaluation, what are you evaluating on what basis?
Yeah, so I mean that is an interesting part of the title, is that what crops up in a lot of the chapters, and there isn't, beyond the shared theme, there's no there's obviously no through line or
glue.
Basically, each author just wrote their chapter in isolation.
Right.
Not really. They occasionally make reference to other chapters, but one of the key things that, probably the key issue that appears a lot, is whether or not these observations should be formative or summative.
Right.
And some of the chapters go into this idea that they can be both. They generally fall on the side of I guess a more humanistic approach.
Right.
Saying that the goal should be teacher development rather than evaluating. But while at the same time recognizing that is sometimes the case. In your experiences being observed, have they been mostly summative, mostly formative? Have you felt like they were there to improve you as a teacher?
That's a good
not
question.
really. This whole thing we talked about was, with Thomas Farrell, fake reflection. They didn't actually make you reflect. It was just kind of how, this is what you did, this is what you didn't do, rather than giving you the chance to really fully reflect on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like we were talking about with Mark Jones. Like when he did his dogme lesson.
Yeah. For the Delta.
Yeah, Dip Tessel. Like, even though you've got principles behind it and you know why you're doing it and you can justify it, you're not meeting the requirements. So I think there's a sense where they're saying, we're trying to get you to be a better teacher, but a better teacher means teach the way we want you to teach, which doesn't obviously necessarily mean better. So I think that's what all observation is, really, unless it's done in a very, very liberal environment.
It's quality control. That's mainly what it's done.
Right.
For anything else.
So what comes up a lot in the book is this idea that so some of the chapters are based on research into both sides of it, how the observee feels and how the observer feels.
Right.
There's a whole chapter on observing or evaluating experienced teachers. There's one chapter where they did research and he had to ask for volunteers or people to talk or people to be observed, and all what he classified as like super experienced teachers said no, like they're the ones who didn't want to be, basically. And what comes out through the voices of the observees is that no matter how it's framed, they always feel like they're being evaluated,
right?
And that they kind of see that as a stumbling block, that is, even no matter how much emphasis you put on it as being a formative procedure, the person being watched still feels like they're being evaluated, being assessed.
I think that's probably true, though.
Yeah.
Because as an observer, you can never really be impartial. It's like when people say, if you go to the gym, no one cares about what you're doing. No one's interested. It's just you. But actually, everyone is looking at you going,
right.
You don't know what you're doing.
So then from the observer side, what comes out is the difficulty of being observer and trying to guide the person that you're observing into developing themselves as a teacher. Because, like you say, no matter what, you ask questions. There's a lot of stuff about, don't say this, ask questions, try to lead them.
Right.
But obviously you're choosing certain questions to ask.
Yeah, and also the questions impact, like when you hear the question, you can imagine what response they're looking for and that kind of thing.
And even if they're not looking for a particular response, that's how it's interpreted.
Yeah.
So when they say, so what do you think about that activity you did in the middle of the lesson? Obviously I'll automatically think, well, he doesn't like it. I have to know what I do with it.
So this book is giving us techniques to evaluate?
There's a chapter which is somebody talking about, I guess, the evaluation system at his institution, and just describes that in detail, which is more about portfolios and that kind of thing.
Right.
There's a lot of advice about ways of framing feedback for observations. The chapter maybe I found most interesting was about as an alternative to maybe traditional observation, focusing just on what they call critical incidents in the lesson.
Yeah.
So you ask the person being observed, just select 5-10 minutes, an incident, and then just go into that in depth.
It's kind of like the presentation we saw by John Fanslow, which we all had different opinions on, whereas very specific focus and trying to figure out what happens in that very specific interaction.
Yeah, and I think that is one way. It doesn't. I guess that chapter talks about like the typical opening question of an observation, a post-observation feedback is, so how do you think the lesson went?
Yeah.
Which basically.
You tell me, you were there.
Right.
I had one during my CELTA where the tutor said to one, not to me, but to one of the other, he said, and I said, so can you explain why that lesson was so shit? He honestly did.
Well, for a CELTA, that's kind of appropriate, right?
Right, yeah.
Because the person observing you has to pass you or not.
Yes, yeah.
But so the idea of just focusing on a small part of the lesson means the observer they don't feel like they have to defend the whole lesson.
That gives better feedback, surely, if you're focusing on a small but important point of the lesson.
Well, the person who talks about it says that they've been doing it for a long time, and even if it is just on a small part of the lesson, you end up addressing issues that affect the whole lesson or teaching in general.
It's all connected,
which is interesting. Yeah. The book, I guess I could recommend it. It's maybe just a few caveats. Some of the research papers, it's good research and they're well written. They felt to me a little bit more like I don't know, journal articles than book chapters. There's a few of them like that. So as a book as a whole, I got some interesting stuff out of it. Like I said, it probably might serve better as journal articles.
Right.
So, some of them were a little bit more meatier, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any final thoughts about?
I don't do any teacher evaluation. I don't think on my current career trajectory. I don't think I ever will.
Right.
I think that kind of thing is useful. I never like reading edited collections because I think they never really have a tone, a consistent tone.
When I picked it up, I was hoping for a kind of in-depth look into this, and it's a series of articles, which
I don't like the word evaluation. I think that spells trouble. The word evaluation.
It spells evaluation.
Yeah. It's interesting that they went for that in the title because a lot of the chapters do kind of fight against this idea of evaluating teachers.
I think you can evaluate the learning that took place. I think that would be a more of an effective way to frame the situation of being observed.
Well, that's actually one of the really key things that I got from this book, and it's actually counter to the first line of the blurb on the back, which says effective language learning depends on effective instruction, which I disagree with.
Right.
What somebody I should remember, but what somebody points out in the book is that focusing on student outcomes or what the learners are doing is perhaps not a fair way of observing because there isn't this direct connection between what the teacher does and
not always.
Yeah.
Not always. Sometimes there is.
Yeah.
Sometimes there isn't.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, anyway, that's the book, Teacher Evaluation, Second Language Education, edited by Amanda Howard and Helen Donahue. So thanks as always for listening.
And don't forget, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can follow us on Twitter @Teflology, or you can send us an email, teflology@gmail.com. And we've recently got a Facebook page, so please look at that, like that, if you do like it. Like it anyway. Comment, put stuff up there. Yeah.
Yeah. We've also got a website now, which is teflology-podcast.com. That's going to be, from now on, it's going to be kind of the home of the podcast. So we would appreciate comments up there on the episodes as they're uploaded. And yeah, if you have any suggestions or anything like that, that would be a great place for you to post them. So thank you again for listening. It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.